over the last little while, I've been trying to do some thinking around how that might be an interesting place to begin a kind of creative process from. You know, to begin from the idea of a particular formal relationship between people, for example, and then build, you know, things like kind of content or themes or narratives over the top of something like that. And that has generally been an approach that I have enjoyed taking. So I was going to go back, and this has all kind of been developed through a PhD that I completed a few years ago. So I thought I was going to take you a bit through the process of that PhD. I'm just going to read you my PhD for the next 3 hours. No, I'm not going to do that. That would be horrible for you and me. Where to start? So I've always been interested in sort of unusual interactive projects. That's where we begin, you know, as I just said. Didn't have too much of an interest in things like themes or in characters. I was never any good physically, as some of you will have seen earlier today. But I was interested in interactivity, in the relationships between audiences and people. I made a few different projects. I made a piece called Exposures, in which the audience got given an envelope containing a disposable camera with 24 exposures on it and a list of 24 photographs they had to take around the city. Like, if you wanted to tell somebody you loved them, where would you go? You know, if you wanted to hide a body, where would you put it? And people had to go around the city and take a photograph for each one, and then we turned that into an exhibition. I made a piece called The Motor Bicycle Baptism for Battersea Arts Centre, which was a piece about hazing rituals. And because in Finland, apparently, I don't know if you know this, in Finland, a motor bicycle is the nickname given to first-year students because they're not old enough yet to drive a car, but they can have a little, like a scooter. So it was, so talking about hazing rituals in which the one audience member became the performer for the next person. So you'd come as an audience member and you'd be blindfolded and then given this series of tasks around the venue. And the last one of those tasks was for you to then take on the costume of the performer and then play the same role for the next audience member. So it was kind of working on a loop. And the question was, you know, if someone's really mean to you with the things that they demanded you do, like having a glass of water thrown in your face, having a stranger kiss you, being left out on the street on your own, then are you equally cruel to the next person in turn, or do you kind of behave more gently? It's sort of empathy and cruelty in very much the kind of tradition of hazing rituals. And I made quite a few pieces with a company called Hide and Seek, who were a game-making company, including a piece called Checkpoint, in which the audience was responsible for dismantling an entire living room and smuggling it piece by piece across a busy public space, past a team of border guards, and then reassembling it on the other side. The fun thing of which was that the only way you could do that was by the best way to play the game was by appearing not to be playing the game. So to appear to be just an ordinary person wandering around in this public space, like the South Bank Centre, for example, where we did it. Which I really like. I like the idea of ordinary people pretending to be ordinary people, and kind of the thing of that. So, I was interested in these. I was really interested, excited about these ideas of kind of what you can get people to do, and how the doing of those things changes people's minds and changes the way they think about the world. But it was all a little haphazard, and I didn't really have any vocabulary or structure or for how I was doing this. And I didn't really have any kind of history for, you know, what's the kind of history. We were talking at lunchtime about training and about, you know, these, in particular schools of dance and movement, you've got this kind of wonderful vocabulary and memory, collective memory of history to draw on when making new work, you know. But in this kind of interactive field, I felt like, well, where's my history? Where's my kind of collective memory here? And where's the language that I can use or think about when I'm sort of building these work? Or am I starting from scratch every single time? And that's where I started a PhD from in 2008, I think, which feels like it wasn't very long ago, but turns out it is a long time ago now. It's like 7 years ago. So I began this PhD attempting to explore a kind of particular historical period in order to understand its influence on my work and the work of other people making similar projects today. And that particular historical period was New York in the 1960s, and particularly the sort of the New York avant-garde in the 1960s, the happenings, Fluxus, Judson Dance. We'll go through these things in a second. And what I thought was particularly interesting about that is that it's a historical moment that's more often remembered as belonging to galleries and museums than it is to, say, theatre makers or game designers. And I wanted to kind of maybe change that slightly. So why New York in that particular period? Well, I think it's because it kind of represented the kind of the coming together of, or an explosion of interest in these ideas around the relationships between audiences and each other, and audiences and space and city. You know, this was a moment at which the idea of what art was being sort of violently torn out of frames or off stages and into the kind of everyday interactions of people. So some examples of that. Perhaps the biggest, you know, the most prominent example being, or one of the kind of foundation texts of this entire period is John Cage's 4:33, right? Which is, well, by reputation is 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence, but obviously it's not 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence. It's 4 minutes and 33 seconds of you listening to the world with the concentration you'd normally reserve for music. Okay? So what Cage is doing there is taking the frame of a musical piece, this idea that you would normally go and you know what a piece of music is. You go and it's something you listen to, something outside of yourself, and you listen to it and then you go home and you say whether it was good or not. But he's taking that frame and he's kind of blowing a hole in the back of it, you know, so that we're not listening to music. Now it's all about us and our ability to listen to and collect the information coming to us from the world, to listen to the world in a different way. There's a wonderful anecdote I probably don't have time to go into of a guy called Tony Smith, who was an artist who one night in about 1958 or something went on a joyride with a bunch of students down the unbuilt New Jersey Turnpike. So a turnpike is a toll road. So he's just driving down this uncompleted toll road, just black tarmac out into the world. And he has this revelation about the nature of art, you know, looking through this kind of vocabulary of half-built structures and buildings and this experience. And he was like, this is a kind of a total monumental experience that goes beyond any pictorial art. You know, you say there's no way of framing it. You just have to experience it. Right? So it's, again, tearing the frame out of the edge of art, which is what's happening all over New York at this time. A guy called Alan Capral writes a legendary piece called On the Legacy of Jackson Pollock, where he talks about the fact that what Jackson Pollock had done was, you know, Jackson Pollock had paved the way for people to just abandon sort of frames and pictures completely, because, you know, already Jackson Pollock's work is as much a documentation of a performance as it is a framed picture. It's sort of moving beyond the limits of the frame. He said, what did he say? This is what Alan Capral said. He said, Pollock, as I see him, left us at the point where we must become preoccupied with and even dazzled by the space and objects of our everyday life, either our bodies, clothes, rooms, or if need be, the vastness of 42nd Street. Okay? All of this that's going on at this point is about taking the relationships out of the frame of the work, whether it be a theatre show or a picture with, you know, various people interacting in it, and making the art about the relationships between us as viewers and the space and all of those things that are going on. And that for me was like, that's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in that moment where art becomes not something that we're looking at, but something that we are implicitly a part of, you know? The art is the relationship that we're having, or the way that I'm looking at the world. As Tim Etchell from Forced Entertainment said, sometimes all you need to do is point out of the window and ask people to look. Sometimes that act of pointing, that way of looking, is itself an art. And I was like, yes, this is what it's about. So, so I started looking at this period and tried to. Here we go. So things like, this is Alan Caprow again, talking about happenings. So I was looking at things like happenings, which were this kind of, these sort of very avant-garde performances that would happen in unlikely spaces. So Caprow says, the environment is not a setting for a play, which is more important than the people. The accented or oblique activity within the environment is the event. There is an absolute flow between event and environment. So I'm sort of looking at things like happenings, like the Fluxus movement, which was a kind of big collective, again, of slightly sort of surrealist artists and performance artists who would perform these kind of crazy actions or give these sort of things like event scores, just like a set of instructions printed on a piece of paper for someone to perform, and that's the artwork. I was looking at some of the avant-garde dance that would happen in the 60s. People like Trisha Brown, who one of her most famous pieces was just a man walking down the outside of a building, or Roof piece that she made, which is a piece that has dancers playing a game of Chinese whispers with bodies and movements positioned on various rooftops across the whole of New York. Amazing piece. So I'm starting to look at this work, and I'm trying to understand its relationship to what I'm making today. But it's difficult to know where to start, right? Because our current means, or at least I felt when I was trying to do this, is everyone with me so far? I'm not going too quick. If at any point I say something that doesn't make any sense, which is quite likely, or I use some terminology which I've just made up myself, also very likely, then please do just say, because it's probably not that you're an idiot, it's just that I've said something that doesn't make any sense. So I'm trying to kind of understand what my relationship might be. I'm trying to understand how to relate to this work and how to make sense of it in relation to my own work. But I'm kind of struggling because the means that we currently have of remembering that work feels inadequate. Right? Because it's orientated around a visual memory. So much documentation of performance work and other kind of events is still based around this sort of this visual documentation, as today is ably demonstrated, and that's a problem for me because it leaves us with an inadequate representation of what that work was. Even things like so for example, if you've got a piece that exists of a series of kind of sort of interactions that happen out on a street between different people and members of the public. And someone takes a couple of photographs of that, and those photographs get put into the archive at MoMA in New York. And then I go, in 2009, and I sit in the MoMA archive in New York, which is in this massive warehouse in Queens. And you open that file, and what you've got there is these images, it's these two pictures that have become completely, that have taken the place of the work and turned it into something that it wasn't. Perhaps the best example of this is a piece by Bruce Nauman. No, not Bruce Nauman. I can't remember the guy's name. It's the crazy German guy who painted his face gold. You know who I'm talking about? Can't think. Yes. What's his name? Can't remember. Anyway, so this guy makes this piece, and I'll remember his name in a second. It's Joseph Beuys. So Joseph Beuys makes a piece called, Teaching Pictures to a Dead Hair. And this is an incredibly legendary piece. Everyone knows this piece. He's got this, he covers his face in gold, and he's holding this dead hair. And and he's kind of gripping it in his teeth at one point, the ears of this dead hair, and it's hanging down. And he basically is showing this dead hair around the gallery. And there's some amazing pictures of this, as you can imagine. It's really visually striking. It's got this gold face, this dead hair, just looking like mad and German in the way that, artists in the 1960s absolutely should look. But the problem is that that's not what the experience of the piece was that anyone. So that's what people think about when they think about that piece. They think about this guy with the gold face. And in fact, people have done reenactments of that piece. So Marina Abramović did a reenactment of that piece. And that's what she was. She was sat there with a gold face and the dead hair. But that's not what the experience was like for an audience that was actually there. Because the way in which that piece worked was that on a cold sort of winter night in New York, Joseph Beuys locked the doors of this theatre. So this kind of high-class audience that had gone down to the gallery tonight to see this performance couldn't get into the gallery. So they're stuck outside looking in through the windows while this man with a gold face is moving around the gallery explaining these pictures to this dead hair. And that to me feels absolutely... And they're getting cross and cold and angry, and he's inside just with this inanimate creature showing it these pictures. And that to me feels absolutely crucial to the essence of what that piece is, right? It's about this relationship between the gallery space and the audience stuck outside, and the relationship between him whispering his knowledge about these artworks to this inanimate object in quite a kind of confrontational way, whilst the people who've paid to be there are excluded from that private conversation. But through the visual, through the kind of... because we tend to archive and document and remember things visually, we don't remember what it felt like. Shouldn't probably bang that, should I?
Hi, future Jorge. Hope you're having a nice time listening to this, wherever you are. Maybe take a break. Go and get a coffee or something. Talk about the hair some more.
Cool. Okay, fuck. Right, no, it's okay. Yeah, I've just halved your speaking time.
Yes. Past Jorge has been a dick to me. Don't worry. I know you've got my back.
Anyway, I'm going to stop talking to future you now. Yeah, so you get the sense what I mean. Like, the experience of the piece has been kind of removed, and what we remember is the visual, and because that's what's documented. Also, because the kind of institutions that are often remembered in this work are visual art institutions. So obviously they're quite invested in a particular way of remembering this work and sort of transforming it from these kind of experiences into images. I think it is, yeah. Yeah. I think so. And I think you can look at that in, for example, it's often, I think it goes even before pictures. I think that there's something like you look at, for example, when Shakespeare wrote his plays, he didn't write them to be published. I mean, eventually they were published just sort of towards the end of his lifetime. But, like the play itself, I mean, that's why there's so many, let's not go into this now. That's why there's so many kind of problematic renderings of like, say, Hamlet. There's like 3 different versions of Hamlet, right? Because the scrolls, the rolls, people would get a roll of paper and that only had their words on it, right? That's why it's called a roll. And so the piece would come together on stage, is what I'm saying. But so he was as much a theatre maker as he was a writer, a playwright. But what we remember is the document. The document proceeds and we sort of, he gets absorbed within this literary tradition, and the plays become transformed into something else, They become plays rather than performances. And I think that with photography it's the same thing. A similar process takes place where photography is such a powerful way of remembering and documenting that it begins to kind of dominate. And even reenactments that take place today are often, I think Marina Abramović did a piece that was described as, she was doing Valley Exports, a recreation of a Valley Export piece, and it was described as being a performance of the documentation of that thing, rather than an attempt to remake the thing itself. So, I was sort of trying to think, okay, well, how then can we get back to something akin to the experience of those pieces, rather than just images of them? How and a sense of the piece belonging to everyone that participated in it. All of the audience were equal producers of that work, rather than simply the artist who initiated it, right? And I think that's often a thing as well, that it's sort of the artists with hindsight want to kind of take greater ownership of their work by kind of excluding those members of the public, those people that were equal producers of it. I think, often people talk about like fragments when it comes to, no, let's not go into that. I could go down a rabbit hole. So I started to think about, okay, maybe there's a different way of remembering these pieces. Obviously, you can't. I mean, part of the problem is you can't recreate them exactly, because what I'm suggesting is that these pieces that would happen out on the streets of New York would not be a singular experience that could be documented and recreated, but that they are as much kind of made out of the tiny fragmentary interactions of people out on the street, and that particular weather on that day, and the kind of the texture of the bricks that people were walking past as they were going. All of these things become the artwork. All of it is part of what the artwork is. You cannot recreate the entire sort of New York and the way that people thought about life in 1967 again anew. You just can't do that. But perhaps what you can do is to try and sort of create a kind of a blueprint or a frame that will allow people today to interact with each other and the city in a way that has some relationship to that past work, So I often try and think about this like this. Okay, so if someone... Is everyone still with me, by the way? Good. If someone runs down a beach, right, and we think the traditional way of remembering that might be to go and sort of take a plaster cast of the footprints, or take a photograph of the footprints and say, look, here it is, Or you've got these plaster cast of the footprints that you can then sort of display in a gallery. Or you've perhaps got an attempt by someone to very slowly and meticulously put their feet in exactly the same positions that that person was in, right? But you're not going to have any sense of what the feeling was like to run along that beach. You're not going to have any sense of your body speaking to that historic performer's body as they ran along that beach, There's no sense in which perhaps the strategies and the feelings that they were encountering can be replicated through any of those techniques. But what if you look at that set of footprints along the beach, and on the basis of sort of analyzing them, you think about what that person was doing. You think, oh, look, that person was running along a beach. And then you say, on your own beach, in your own city, to an entirely different performer, you say, just run along that beach as fast as you can. That, to me, which is an entirely different performance happening in an entirely different place, but it speaks in a very profound way to that earlier work. Does that make sense? Yeah? So what I was trying to do was create, what I called a spatial blueprint, which would be a kind of an analysis of all the relationships that existed within one of these past works between performers and audience, between the city and between the audience and the city, trying to kind of get an understanding of all of the different sort of network and cluster of different relationships that made that work what it was. And then used that sort of particular skeleton, that blueprint, to try and create an entirely new piece that is not claiming to be or pretending to be that earlier work, but is something new that relies upon the same architecture, that relies upon the same blueprint. And through the doing of that new piece, perhaps the audience, this is where it gets into which is where I'm not going to venture down, to kind of complex sort of French deconstructionist philosophy, where we start talking about de Soto and Roland Barthes and stuff. But basically the idea being that perhaps when the doing of this new performance becomes a way of talking about, like an embodied way of talking about that old performance. It's your body and your movements are speaking of and speaking to that past work, and you are learning something about it that you'd never learn through looking at a picture of it. So some actual practical examples, because that gets a bit dense. So I looked at Trisha Brown's roof piece, for example. In fact, no, I'm not going to talk about that one. I'm going to talk about Claes Oldenburg's The Store, right? So, in 1961, an artist called Claes Oldenburg found an old empty shop unit on the Lower East Side in one of the most sort of deprived parts of New York at that point. And he turned it into a store. Except all the objects in the store were these kind of giant, gaudy, plaster cast representations of the actual object. So he had giant, kind of gaudily painted candy bars and giant shirts made out of chicken wire with plaster of Paris covering them. So the entire shop is all these bright colors and vivid shapes. But everything is useless. It's all art objects rather than actual practical things. And this was sort of very famous at the time. It was sort of then later connected up with like the beginnings of pop art, and sort of objects from the store are now regularly shown in galleries everywhere. But again, that for me is not an accurate representation of what that actually felt like to do. Because for me, so I had sort of looked at this at the store, and I thought, okay, well, what are the spatial relationships? What are the relationships between audience and space and city that structure that experience? And I was like, okay, well, you've got this really fascinating situation in which you go into that, as you walk to that store, as you go in and as you leave, you're kind of in two places at the same time, right? Because you're walking through the streets of Lower East Side of New York. You're kind of absorbed within this kind of alien and exciting landscape. You're very much connected to and a part of the landscape. And the place that you're going to, it looks like a store, and it operates like a store, like any other store around in the neighborhood. And you go in and you buy something and you leave and you go home again. And it's like you're kind of disappearing into that landscape in quite kind of an immersive way. And Claes Oldenburg would be sat there behind a till, and you'd go in and you'd buy something, then you'd leave, and you're gone again, you know? It's almost like you're playing the role of someone within that neighborhood, within that city. But at the same time, it's also completely alien to that particular neighborhood, because like everything in that store costs like $400. Like no one's going to go and, like no one who actually lives there is going to go in and spend $400 on a fucking made up chocolate bar that doesn't even have any chocolate in it. Okay, cool. So, and the only people that no one from the local neighborhood actually went there, because it's all expensive, pointless stuff, and it's a gallery, you know, because it's a gallery. It's not a store, it's a gallery. It's a gallery funded by some rich people who live uptown in a different part of New York, going down into that area of town, and, you know, and so at the same time as being completely embedded within its community and within its neighborhood, it's also completely alien from it. It's completely abstracted from that particular neighborhood. And I think Claes Oldenburg is really aware of this. And I think that the experience is this very strange experience that I think probably a lot of people who go to kind of unusual art events like Punch Drunk or whatever, when it's in the middle of a kind of quite rundown area of Wapping or what have you, like that's the same experience. You're like, well, this thing is both, I feel like I'm both within this neighborhood and within this community and kind of abstracted from it, taken out of it. And that to me was the essence of that piece. It wasn't about like giant gaudy pop art candy bars or, you know, about making a store. It was about this disconnectedness, this connectedness and disconnectedness to the city at the same time. So I thought, well, so I took that sense of how this piece worked and what its relationship was to the city and what it was like as an audience member to arrive at that place, to go in, to buy something, to be kind of performing the role of someone in a store whilst at the same time playing a completely different role. And I used that as the starting point for making my own piece. And the idea was that this piece would use that structure, would use that skeleton, that rather than beginning with any theme or any content or any characters. It began simply with that structure, with that relationship that I hoped the piece would have between audience and city. And I made a piece called, we've spoken about this before, I made a piece called Cab, which was an unlicensed minicab service to take people from like obscure, hard-to-reach live art venues in distant parts of London back to where they lived, which was invariably fucking miles away. So you could call me up and book me, and I would come and pick you up in my car, and I would drive you back to where you live, and you could pay me what you want, and that was it. That was the end of the interaction. But at the same time, the piece was also, it operated like a taxi service. It worked like a taxi, it took you home. But at the same time, the piece was also an audio piece. So I took all of these bits of abstract sound, bits of field recordings, some old songs, a clip of Orson Welles reading Moby Dick, various other things, and created this kind of sound collage. And as you got in the back of a cab, you would put a set of headphones on, and you were listening to this sound piece as you moved through the city. So, and again, which is something, making sort of audio walks and sound pieces, that's very familiar language for kind of contemporary performance makers and for contemporary performance audiences, right? So at the same time, you're in these two spaces that you perhaps recognize equally. You're in the back of a minicab, but you're also within the sort of headphoney confines of a particular performance. And that was my attempt to use that, and that was it's quite an interesting process to go by, because again, I began with an idea of exactly how I wanted the performance to work and what relationships I wanted the performance to generate between an audience member, between the city, between me as a performer, and everything else. And then kind of started to add the layers on top of it. So then thought about, okay, well maybe what would be my equivalent of a store? Well, it would probably be a minicab, because one of my presiding memories of London is traveling back in minicabs from distant places to various parts of it. So yeah, that was basically the kind of process that I went on. And I think since then I've been using quite a lot this idea of perhaps beginning by constructing or thinking about what the spatial blueprint, what the cluster of relationships that structure the piece might be, and actually using that as a starting point, rather than that being something that becomes evident once you've started to actually make the piece. So, for example, the moving away from the PhD, which you'll probably all be. Moving away from the PhD, which you probably all be quite relieved at. The most recent piece that I made was called Put Your Sweet Hand in Mine, and I made it with my friend Ira. And we didn't really know anything about the piece when we started, except that we decided that what we wanted to create was this piece that we started basically by making our own sort of spatial blueprint for how the piece would work, and then building up material and content for the piece from there. So we decided that we wanted it to be about two audience members. We wanted the piece to be structured around two audience members who were imagining all these different possible relationships that they might have together to each other, and we thought we wanted that to be structured sort of like a relationship. So it wasn't that it was explicitly about you falling in love with the person that you were sat opposite and imagining your life together, but it was using, I suppose, the emotional, the feeling of each of those different stages in a relationship, from the initial awkward first eyes at each other through to the kind of the flirtatious early conversations, a kind of deep sense of comfort and togetherness, through to things getting brittle and hostile, to sort of some sense of resolution. Using each of those stages to structure a series of different scenes in which those two audience members would imagine different relationships that they might have to each other. And through imagining those different relationships to each other, then they could, they would hopefully begin to think about all the different meanings that sort of the idea of love might have, right? So what we'd constructed there was basically a spatial blueprint, right? Does that make sense? We knew that the audience were going to be sat in these two long rows facing each other, and that they'd each be facing a stranger. And we knew that over the course of the piece, their relationship with that person they were sat opposite was going to change in this series of progressive steps. And that's what we began with, that architecture, the architecture of that experience, the relationships between the various constituent parties. And then we started to, write scenes, come up with ideas, produce material, and sort of create, and then on top of that, lights and sound and whatever else. But everything began from having this clear idea about those relationships that people might have to each other. So, on that basis, I thought that it might be interesting to set you a small task. Is that all? Does that make sense? Is that clear? Is that interesting? Good. So yeah, I thought, and obviously this, I'm sort of simplifying things a lot here, very crudely, in the way that I've just described that. But hopefully it might serve as a spur to a slightly different way of thinking about what you're doing, and sometimes perhaps a different starting point to the one that you're normally used to. So what I wanted you to do, I was initially going to say to somebody else's piece, but I think actually it's equally interesting if people work on their own project and try and do what we were talking about. So what I want you to do is to think about your own project, but I want you to think about it in exactly the terms that we've just been talking about, right? I want you to try and sort of identify what the spatial blueprint of your project might be. What are the cluster of different relationships that make up your piece? The relationships between audience and performer, the relationship between audience and the space around them, whether it be the space of the theatre building or the space of the city beyond it. Right? What in quite abstract, non-specific terms, I want you to try and, think of a spatial, or determine what the shape of your piece is based on the relationships that are contained within it. And then I want you so that's the first step, and that should probably maybe take you about 10 minutes or so, just thinking about your work and thinking about all the different sort of crisscrossing interactions that exist within it. In very broad terms, I mean. Then I want you to try and come up with an entirely new idea for a show that uses that same blueprint. So it's a piece that will sort of share all the different relationships with the idea you've already had, but in a completely different way. Is that clear? An example. Yeah. Okay. So for example, in the way that, so I just explained the idea of the piece that I created with my friend Ira, right, which explored love and used this kind of spatial relationship of two audience members facing each other, and then this slow progression of their relationship, and each stage in that progression explores a different possibility of a relationship they might have to each other. And we use that to explore ideas around love and intimacy. But we could equally have used that same structure to create a completely different piece. That, for example, was about competition, right? It was about rivalries and power. And used that same, but still operated in the same way, so that the audience come in, and rather than it being intimate and gentle, and when we made it, we had these beautiful kind of bare light bulbs hanging through the middle of the space. Rather than being like that, it could be quite sparse and tough and cold and gladiatorial, right? So that you're sat opposite this person, like almost as if you're in a game show or a challenge or the fucking Hunger Games or something. And your relationship with that person slowly progresses and changes through a series of different states over the course of the piece. And perhaps, you start off as these kind of, in initial kind of sparring exercises, or you're just eyeing each other up like boxers at a weigh-off. And then you're kind of going into this kind of like, you know, this like slap talk, this jive talk with each other, and then it's kind of into sort of sparring, not literal sparring, but, you know, the idea of using sparring as a sort of a metaphor for a particular scene, right? Going into kind of full-on combat and, you know, this fierce rivalry, and then kind of ending perhaps in some kind of grudging resolution, right? So I've used that same, you see what I mean? I've used exactly the same structure, exactly the same spatial, like, blueprint, exactly the same relationships between space and audience and artist to create a completely different kind of piece. And I think that's what we'd like you to do. So to just try and identify all the different relationships that exist within the work that you're making, and then see if you can think of a different way in which you might use that same structure to create a new piece. Yeah, well, roughly. I mean, if it's a very simple, you know, it might be that it's a very elaborate piece and you have to spend a lot of time thinking about that and you don't have so much time thinking about the new piece. That's fine. Or it might be that actually it's very, very simple and then you can spend much more time thinking about. But I would suggest maybe roughly 10 minutes just having a proper think about how your piece works.